highlight all the amazing work which is done by equally amazing people. So today, we will hold a conversation with Dr. Raj Vedam. Brief introduction, Dr. Vedam holds a doctorate in electrical engineering. His work experience is in diverse industries, including the power, aircraft, design automation, and oil and gas. And he has made multidisciplinary contributions to several areas and even holds several patents. So Dr. Vedam is an innovative leader, and his research intersects various disciplines. So today he will be speaking to us about science in stories. Dr. Vedam, thank you for joining us on the Indic Forum.
Namaste, Anjali ji. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So we will jump into this conversation. What do stories mean to different cultures, particularly India and Greece? That is our topic today. So please, let's start with that.
Excellent question. Excellent question. So we come from a culture where there's a very rich tradition of stories. So stories are there in several of our texts, whether you take the Puranic texts or the Itihasas or several other works, we find that the metaphor of stories. Stories is used with various metaphors, pedagogical purposes, and so on. And it served an excellent purpose in entertaining people as well as communicating some wisdom. Now, we find that is there in the ancient Indians as well as the ancient Greeks. When we see contemporary academic studies on these, there's an attempt to cast them in a framework where they say that the period of time when cultures all over the world try to infuse their divinities with anthropomorphical notions and habits and human-like qualities and jealousies and anger and love and lust, and all these things were infused in the divinities. It's a kind of a reflection. So that is the way contemporary academia tries to see how stories have evolved. My own reading of stories has been different. So I see that in the context of contact between cultures. I see them in the context of pedagogy. Is there something that the ancients had wanted to communicate? And I see them in the context of encoding moral wisdom or observational wisdom or other such things in stories. So this is my take on stories. Stories serve a very important purpose in community life, in bringing people together. Today, of course, you got television, you got YouTube on your mobile devices and whatnot. You're self-entertained. You don't need anybody to entertain you. However, we in ancient times lived in clusters where entertainment was done through stories. Stories not only entertained, but also educated people on morals, on wisdom, understanding nature, so many other things. So stories are central to the human experience. That's what I'd say, Anjali ji.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And is there any evidence that stories were used as a pedagogical tool?
Okay. That's an excellent question. So let me share my screen, and I would like to show you PowerPoint slides that will communicate what I'm trying to say a little more effectively. So we have some, let me know if you can see my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So we do have evidence of knowledge domain mapping. What do I mean by that? By that, I mean that in the Indian context, we have evidence that some kind of information, in this case, what I've shown here, it's mathematical. Some mathematical information was encoded in a literary device over here, mapping numbers to letters. So this is what they call an alpha-syllabic numeral system. And here we can see, for example, how the number was encoded in this particular mechanism by Aryabhatta. And the same mechanism was used in Kerala by Madhava of the Sangama Grama. He employs the same Kattapayadi system. And he enlists that, which is basically an encoding from the consonants and the vowels and the multipliers and what the numbers are. he uses that to represent the trigonometric signs of angles. So clearly, in the domain of mathematics and sciences, we know the artifice of converting numbers to letters and words was used. So this is the first example I want to show you how it is used in pedagogy. This is the second example. Playfair was somebody who was an Indologist, came to India 1822 and wrote his Astronomy of the Brahmins. And he had eyewitness accounts of how the Brahmins were doing astronomy. For example, here is a picture from a French eyewitness who made engravings and drawings of how these things were done. And he shows how here a priest has in front of him shells, and in his hands you see he's got palm leaves. His wife is behind nursing a child. This is their house. And you see that he's seating himself on the ground, arranging his shells before him. He repeats the enigmatical verses that are to guide his calculation. And from his little tablets of palm leaves, he takes out the numbers that are to be employed, and he gets his result with wonderful certainty. But he has little knowledge of the principles on which his rules were founded. He doesn't care. He doesn't care, why do my methods work? All he knows is if I take these shells, perform this calculation, it gives me an index, I go into the palm leaf, read it, and there's another formula or mantra to be said that tells me what to do next. So formulas were versified, it yields an index to palm leaves, and it enabled computation. So we see one more encoding of information within verses and so on. And the third example I'd like to show is that this literary device, the transmitters and methods, Kavya, highly artificial Sanskrit literary style that is used. It uses metaphors, similes, predominate with hyperbole at times, with very, very erudite subjects and ideas. So what I'd like to show is, today, for example, we might have a PhD engineer. I'd like to take myself as an example, where I might do some system studies, let's say on the electrical power network or on IC chips and other such things. I might discover an algorithm, which is a mathematical means and a bunch of steps in order to do something that'll give me some information. But when I tell an operator what to do, I convert them into steps, into a simple algorithm where the operator doesn't have to understand why are we doing this. All he knows is when this number goes up, I'll turn this knob. When that number goes down, I'll turn this knob. So he doesn't have to understand the why and how it was done, only follow that mechanism. Similarly, you go to a PhD biochemist. They're going to study COVID-19. What are the pathways that this virus is impacting a human body? How do we get sick? And in the process, hopefully, we'll get a drug. When it is implemented by a general practitioner doctor, the doctor doesn't have to know. He might know, but he doesn't have to know the pathways. All he knows is that this particular drug prescribed 3 times and this 200 mg or 500 mg can reduce your illness. So he doesn't have to understand everything the biochemist does. The same way with our index systems. The rishis and the acharyas were the knowledge producers. They discovered and created knowledge. And they also had to encode it in some mechanism so that it could be implemented by the practitioner. So the practitioner has got no idea or insight of the rishis, but they know that if they follow these steps, they will get the things that the rishi did. So very, very interesting that we see time and again that pedagogy has been used in the Indian context. And this one shows, for example, Anjali ji, this one shows that very often we find the same personalities are used in the context of different stories. So what I say is that our ancients, they considered a palette of possibilities, of personalities and divinities. Just like an artist today has got a palette of colors, they mix it, match it, and the same colors are used in different paintings to do different things. Our rishis and knowledge producers, they use the same actor in different contexts. Here's an example of Ganesha. One example, when he writes the Vedas, Vyasa is dictating it, he breaks off his tusk and he writes it as Ekadantaya over here. Another example is when he's walking on the road, he falls down and Chandra laughs at him. He's angry. He breaks off his tusks and throws it at Chandra. So the same context, same actor, and the subject is the same, how he became Ekadantaya, but there are 2 different meanings that are sought to be communicated. So here is an example that I've provided how pedagogy has been used and how there is proof in the Indian context, whether it is in mathematics, whether it is in astronomy, whether it is in some poetic works or otherwise. We find repeatedly that the metaphor of stories were used as a device to communicate information.
I see. Super fascinating.
Yes.
Yes, super. I mean, just yes. So, are stories the only way pedagogy was conveyed?
Okay. So that is an excellent question. Excellent question. So I think one way to look at that question is to see, is all of Indian knowledge or Greek knowledge were they communicated only in stories? And the answer is no. We have clear evidence that there were great masters in the Indian context. For example, if you look at works like Shushruta Samhita, or you look at Charaka Samhita, or you look at Aryabhatta's Aryabhatiya, or you look at Surya Siddhanta, very clearly there is no metaphor of stories used here. There is intricate knowledge, specialized intricate knowledge has been encoded in these works because their works were intended for fellow researchers. It is like if you and I write a research paper today, we are not writing it for common consumption, but it might be to address a critic who's also gone through a similar kind of knowledge system as you have. So you're addressing the critique and you're writing it at such a level so that the outsider who comes and reads it, it's very difficult to understand because there's a lot of background behind that, a lot of references to understand, a lot of context, metaphors, and other things to understand before you understand this. So it's clear that in the Indian context, we had gurus who were producing enormous knowledge without the metaphor of stories. Now, that said, that is a very rarefied set of people. You needed to go to a university like Takshashila or Nalanda. You had to study there for several years at the feet of the masters, and then you'll understand Surya Siddhanta. Then you might understand Charaka Samhita's works. So what did the common man do? And like I said, for the common man, the rishis had this metaphor encoded inside stories. Whether it is a moral wisdom, whether it is an observational scientific wisdom, or any other kind of information they wanted to encode, they would put it in the capsule of an entertaining story. Because stories survive. The human mind craves for entertainment. Every minute we want to be entertained. Today, with the amount of attention span we have, we go to WhatsApp, we go to Instagram, we go to Twitter, Facebook, we see that. We want to be entertained all the time. So our ancients knew that. So they knew if they took these divinities and personalities and wove a story around that and encoded a wisdom inside that, that story will survive. And guess what? These stories have survived. Even after 6,000, 7,000 years, here are you and I in new forums of electronic transmission, and we are still talking about these same stories and wisdom. So that shows the power of these stories to communicate information. In contrast, if I'm sitting in a classroom or let's say a high school kid sitting in a geometry class and learning about a theorem, oh my God, that's so boring. The minute the teacher's done, you're out of the classroom, you just want to forget it, forget about the whole thing. So the rishis knew this. They knew that pedagogy is served when you package entertainment and wisdom and send it across. People eagerly listen to this and they learn from that. So this is a powerful teaching mechanism that our ancients have evolved. So it's a pity that it's gone out of our classrooms today. I would love to be in a classroom where I'm taught in stories.
Right, absolutely. People would stay awake for sure. So can you give us examples of stories from ancient cultures, please, especially India?
Okay.
We can talk about Greek too.
Okay, Greek and India. So lots of stories are there. So let me think. So let me set the stage, the Greek story, and then we'll go to the Indian stories.
Okay.
So in ancient Greece, we have stories, many stories, the stories of the Titans, the story of Pandora's box, the story of the Minotaur, many stories are there in the Greek tradition. I'd like to choose one particular story, and this is the story of the goddess Artemis. Artemis was a goddess of the hunt. She was also the protector of virgin girls. So virgin girls, she's a protector divinity for them and so on. So Orion was a famous hunter. So one day when he's going about doing his business and so on, he sees the Pleiades are playing in a lake. Who are the Pleiades? The Pleiades are the 7 virginal sisters. And so these young girls are playing, and Orion comes, sees them, he gets enamored by these Pleiades, and he starts pursuing them. And obviously, the Pleiades don't want this unwanted attention. And so they try to go away from there. They run here and there. But this man, oh my goodness, he's a serial chaser. So he's chasing these Pleiades all over the place. And Artemis sees this. And Artemis is the protector of virginal girls. And she's upset. And so she goes to Zeus and says, Zeus, you better stop this. I don't like this fellow chasing these Pleiades. However, Zeus does not do anything, and Artemis is very upset. She thinks that these men are out to do these things. I had to protect my girl somehow. So she asks Zeus again, do something. Zeus says, all right, I'll convert the Pleiades into doves. So the Pleiades become doves, and they start fluttering and flying away from Orion. However, Orion also starts chasing them. He's not done with it. Artemis is furious that Zeus is not serious about saving her girls. So she goes to Scorpio, the scorpion, and tells Scorpio that, can you kill this Orion? So Scorpio challenges Orion, and he finally kills Orion. Zeus now, he immortalizes both Orion and the Pleiades and makes them stars in the sky. So he makes Orion is a huge constellation that comes in the winter months. And a little ahead of Orion are the Pleiades. It's a bunch of small 6 stars that we can see, very faint. It looks like a small kite. And so even today in the sky, if you look at it, it looks like from the eastern horizon, first Pleiades arises. And behind Pleiades is this huge constellation of Orion. So they're sailing in the skies as if the Pleiades are running away from Orion is chasing them all the time. So what we learn from the story are 2 things. One is, it is a way to teach the Greeks about the relative positions of the Pleiades and Orion in the sky. If you know the story that Orion chases the Pleiades, then all you have to do is first you locate the giant Orion constellation of the sky. You can't miss it. It looks like the 3 sword of Orion, all those things. You can't miss it at all. It's called the Mriga Nakshatra in the Indian context. You can't miss it. You see that, and you look a little ahead of it, and there you see Pleiades. Now, the second wisdom, what did they want to talk about Orion? Orion and Scorpio. They said Scorpio kills Orion. And the meaning for that is, as Orion sets in the western skies, Scorpio just begins to rise in the east. Can you imagine this, setting and rising 180 degrees away? So it's a metaphor for birth and death. So the ascendancy of Scorpio is the death of Orion. Orion dies and goes away over there. So by knowing this story, if somebody wanted to locate where is Scorpio in the sky, they see the setting Orion, say, look to the east. In the east, you see Scorpio is just coming up over there. So the Greeks used the metaphor of stories to fix the relative position of constellations in the sky. So these stories enabled their citizens to internalize these things and know the night sky perfectly. They knew where different constellations were. Mm-hmm. So that is an example of the Greek stories. Let me tell you stories about Indian story also, an Indian story. So we have stories, for example, about Chandra. Chandra is the moon. And we have a story about how Chandra married the 27 daughters of King Daksha. A very, very strange story where there is 27 wives that he has, and people laugh at this. What do you mean? Chandra is not a human being. It doesn't marry 27. What are these 27? And so on and so forth. But a little reflection and understanding makes us understand that ancient Indians had wanted to communicate information about the night sky. So it turns out that every day the moon appears in the eastern sky at a different time, and therefore against a different backdrop of the stars. They also observed it takes approximately 27 days for the moon to come back to the same backdrop of stars. Because of that, they said, let's divide the entire ecliptic into 27 segments of 13 1/3 degrees each. And each of these, we identify the principal brightest star in that segment of the sky. and that would be the name of a nakshatra. And to remember the name of the nakshatra, they gave the names of the wives of the moon. For example, things like Kritika, Rohini, Swati, Chitra, all these things were names of the wives of the moon. And by knowing the stories of the nakshatras, we also know the relative positioning in the sky and where they are. There are many stories in the Indian context too that relate to positioning of the nakshatras in the sky and how we can find these things. So clearly the Indian story now is talking about all of these things. Now let me take it a little further. The Indian story also says that Chandra's father-in-law Daksha had learned that his son-in-law, the moon, is favoring one of his daughters more than the others. He heard that Chandra loves Rohini.
Rohini, right.
He loves Rohini more than the other girls. And how on earth can he do that? How can he treat my daughters not the same? And so he gets so upset with Chandra because of this, that he's only favoring one wife and not paying attention to the others. And he goes and curses them. He says that you are going to die because of your unequal treatment of my daughters. Now, Chandra is so perturbed, he runs away to Mahadeva and prays, Mahadeva, I don't want to die, please save me. And Mahadeva says, all right, you're not going to die. What will happen is you will fade and fade and fade. And after your death, you'll be reborn once again. And you'll go through a process of waxing and waning. And in remembrance of that, even today, you see the iconography of Shiva. You find the moon as part of this story over there, how moon was saved over here. And this story, by the way, there are two things hidden over here. One thing hidden is the synodic month. And the other thing hidden is this 27 days and the 30 days. For example, for the moon to come back to the same backdrop with the stars, it takes 27 days. However, if you take the phases of the moon from new moon to new moon, it takes 30 days. So there are two stories hiding here that's communicating two calendrical systems. One is hiding the 27-day calendrical system where the moon comes back to the same nakshatra. The other is hiding the phases of the moon that from new moon to full moon and back to new moon is going to take approximately 30 days. So two stories are hiding in this main story. So, but that said, the story progresses on and we need to understand why did Chandra love Rohini. It turns out that there's a phenomenon called occultation. From your perspective, if this hand of mine is the moon and this is a star, sometimes the moon appears to come close to a star, it does not cover it. And sometimes it actually covers a star in its path through the sky. So we see this. This phenomenon is called a lunar occultation. So it turns out that if you study the number of times the moon occults the various stars, nakshatras in the sky, it occults Rohini the most. Primarily a concept based upon where are the stars, nakshatras distributed in the night sky as a function of the ecliptic. Ecliptic is where the path of the sun and the moon, how they traverse. So there is a tilt to the earth, tilt to the orbits and other such things. And depending on all, a whole bunch of these factors, it talks about these things. So it turns out that moon occults Rohini much more than it occurs any other nakshatra. And this occultation comes in a period of 4 years. In a period of 4 years, which repeats all over after 19 years. This is the so-called maiden cycle and so on. So we find that in the last occultation cycle, 2014 to 2018, I counted approximately 53 occultations of Rohini, which is Aldebaran, by the moon. Whereas in the previous occultation cycle of Kritika, which is the Pleiades, in 2006 or 2004 to 2008, I forget the exact window over there, it was only occulted about 26 times. So can you imagine our ancients went through a period of observing the sky again and again, the path of the moon through the nakshatras, which nakshatra is the moon touching more than the others, and oh my goodness, he loves Rohini, but more than the others. And they encoded that into a lovely romantic story about how the moon loves Rohini more than the other nakshatras.
Right.
So this is an example, a second example of a story where the Indian stories are encoding information about the months as well as occultation. So before we leave the subject, Anjali ji, let me tell you one more fascinating story.
Please, yes.
Fascinating story. So this story has got to do with the Pleiades. The Pleiades is the same thing as a Kritika nakshatra. Now I'm going to show you similarities between Greek stories and Indian stories. So in the Greek tradition, we learn there are 7 Pleiades, 7 sisters, who I told you Zeus puts them in the sky. But if you look at Pleiades today, you only find 6 stars. Where is the 7th star? Where is the 7th star? In the Greek tradition, it says that the 7th sister was called Merope. And Merope had an illicit romance with a mortal. And she was so ashamed of herself that she hid her face. And because she hid her face, you can't see the 7th sister. So you can only see 6 of them. So this is a fascinating story from the Greek tradition on why we can only see 6 of the Pleiades and not the 7th. What does the Indian tradition say about this? In the Indian tradition, the Kritikas were the wives of the Saptarishis. Saptarishi is the great bear. So these were the wives of the Saptarishis. There's 7 Saptarishis, obviously, by the name, and therefore 7 wives are over there. Turns out that the story, the Purani, Markandeya Purana, says that one day Agni was officiating at the yajna that was done by the Saptarishis. And when he was doing the yajna, he happened to see the wives of the Saptarishis who were incredibly beautiful women. So he sees them and he's besotted. He's enamored. Oh my God, these women are so beautiful. Then he feels thoroughly ashamed of himself. These are married women. And what am I doing? Why am I attracted to them? And he's very ashamed. He goes off to do tapas. And because he's doing tapas, he's neglected his own companion, Swaha. So Swaha feels neglected. And she knows that Agni's weakness is the Saptarishi's wives. So Swaha has got the power. So she takes on the form of each of the Saptarishi's wives. So she takes on the form of the first wife and she approaches Agni. And obviously Agni cannot control himself and so on. So she takes on the form of the second wife, third wife, and so on. However, Swaha could not take on the form of Arundhati. Arundhati, who was a wife of Vashishta, she could not take his form because Arundhati is very chaste. Arundhati is a very chaste woman, and because of her powers, Swaha could not take the form of Arundhati. So she could only take the form of 6 of these, 6 of the wives. So as a result of this union, the 6-headed Kartikeya was born. And when Kartikeya was born, there was disturbance in all the worlds and everybody's perturbed. There is confusion and problem everywhere. And the forest dwellers who had seen all this illicit happenings between Swaha and rather the so-called wives of the Saptarishis and Agni, they go and complain to Indra and others. All this happened because of this illegal romance. This happened between Agni and these wives. These poor wives are innocent. And they're so shocked because they have not done anything. But here they are, everybody's accusing them of illicit romance and these kind of things. So in shame, they leave their wives, their husbands. These 6 sisters leave their husbands and they go off and become the Kritikas. The 7th sister stays behind. So she's Arundhati. So even today, through a telescope, if you take a look at Great Bear, you find that along with Vashishta, which is Mizar Alcor, you also find Arundhati over there. So in the Indian story, there are 6 Kritikas because the 7th sister is chaste Arundhati. The same metaphor is there, something illicit. In this case, the 6 sisters did something supposedly illicit and they went. In the Greek tradition, the 7th sister, Merope, did something illicit. So it's a slight reversal, but the similar kind of context is there. So it's fascinating, Anjali ji. Once you start looking at stories from these cultures, we find that the same metaphor is used, the same ideas are there, and it's very, very fascinating.
Amazing. So given the similarities between the 2 cultures, the Greek and the Indian, will you talk about this kind of cross-culture transfer in the backdrop of Aryanism and Indo-European migrations?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So it turns out that one is very right in asking, why are there similarities between the Indian stories and the Greek stories? Does it mean that Indians copied these stories from the Greeks? Or does it mean the Greeks copied these stories from the Indians? It's highly unlikely that you take story after story and you find the similarities over there. Why did these stories come? So today, the people who love the Aryan invasion story, they love to say that these are all the stories of the Indo-European people. And the reasons for the similarities is because the Indo-European people had similar contact all over the place and so on. So before I move away from this idea, let me give you one anecdote. So early on, when the colonialists and the Eurocentric scholars, they were trying to understand on the basis of linguistic analysis, they were trying to understand these migrations of people or the proposed migration of people. And they had said that this Harappan civilization, which they had discovered in late 1800s, early 1900s, when excavation was being done by John Marshall in the early 1900s, they said we have evidence of destroyed buildings and ruins and all these things. And you look at the Vedas, oh my goodness, it looks like Indra is a man on a rampage. He's a war machine, literal one-man war machine. He's going around destroying forts, Purandara, the destroyer of forts, and so on and so forth. So they said that here is evidence that there's an Aryan invasion. This is one more idea that they use, saying the Rig Veda appears to be a war manual of these people, pastoral people, who are warlike, came in their chariots and destroyed the Harappan civilization. Until such time that other scholars who are studying the stories of these cultures said, wait a minute. There are stories also in the Norse stories. The Nordic people, they also have stories where there's an Indra-like character. And Indra's nemesis was, I think, Vritra. Vritra was his nemesis. So he's always battling Vritra. Even in the Norse tradition, there is a similar character who's battling a similar protagonist. So they said that because of the commonality of stories, I don't think Indra is a destroyer of forts. Purandara, you can't say this is what happened. There are common stories everywhere. That's why you're seeing this. So this is an anecdote I wanted to show how these ideas shaped our understanding of history also. So my own thesis is that there was out of India migrations in a certain time frame, in several time frames actually, but the last one probably was around 2000 BCE. This is when there was a 200-year monsoon failure in India. There was a drought, as well as the Saraswati River drying up in the same time frame. And that led to an outward migration of people from India into various parts of the world, wherever they could find water. Water was critical, right? Today we got water from a pipe because there are pumps taking water from rivers and sending it to us. We don't even think, where did this water come into the pipe from? But in the old days, if you did not have water, if your rivers had dried up, forget it. Even if you built a magnificent Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, these cities, you abandoned everything. You abandon everything and you go where water is. And so they had gone in search of water in the Fertile Crescent also, the Euphrates, Tigris, the Nile River valleys. And we have evidence of that. Evidence from, for example, the Indian bull, the so-called zebu, the hump bull. We find that in a science paper that came out in 2019, the researchers are saying how they found evidence of this bull suddenly appearing in that in Mitanni lands, which is northern Iraq and Turkey. Suddenly it appears around 4,000 years ago, which they're connecting to this drought event. And we find like this repeatedly. There are stories in the Indian tradition about outward migrations, Anu, Rahu, which could be an earlier time frame, by the way. So there are evidences, internal evidences in India, as well as material evidence that has been found that support the idea of an outward migration, and also consequently the taking of stories, culture, language, and other things to various parts of the world. And this can account for the similarities between the Norse, between the Celts, between the people who lived in Eastern Europe, and all of these people. Why they have similarity with the Indian peoples? Because there's great migrations going out from the Saraswati civilization area into these other parts of the world where culture was taken. In the Greek tradition, it says, if you look at the Greek periodization, you had a so-called Aegean period about 3,000 years ago. Then you have the Mycenaeans who come in, Minoans and the Mycenaeans who come in a certain time frame. After that, the so-called Dorian invasion. Then you have the later time when from Pythagoras onwards, there's a little more record of what happened. They say the Mycenaeans in around 1500 BC, 1000 BC, and so on, they had contact with the Hittites and the Mitannis. So they say they learned from the Hittites and the Mitannis and the Hittites on mathematics, astronomy, culture, stories, and so on and so forth. And that could be a powerful mechanism to take Indian stories. And this also gives enough time in time and space, so these stories are transforming. As you see stories transforming, it is not the directed hand of an intelligence to change stories because they must be in different India and Greece. It's rather an evolution. It's just like if you play the game of whispering in each other's ears in a circle, by the time you get the whisper back, you know the story has changed entirely. A similar way, across time and space, these stories related over generations change and the context change. But in the stories hidden over there, we look at the framework and we understand, yes, the same framework is there. And here we know there are similarities. So this is the reason why I say that in Greek stories and Indian stories, we find similarities, as well as Nordic stories, as well as Celtic stories, practices. We keep finding similarities all over the place because of these outward migrations from India.
Wonderful, super fascinating. And with this, I think I will open this conversation up so we can take questions, if that's okay with you.
Yes, please.
Yes. So either people can unmute themselves and ask a question or put it in the chat. While we wait for the first question, I have a question. Taking the liberty to ask the first question.
Yes.
Just like we have Greek mythology and Roman mythology written down, stories written down, I shouldn't use the word mythology. Do we have something like that from the Indic side? Do we have these stories available to us, especially for the youth?
So the sources of the stories for us are the Puranas, the Upanishads, the various other works are the sources where these stories are. And once we start talking about written down records versus old records, we go into a completely different understanding of where our history is, where it has come from, and so on. The traditional, the received wisdom from academia, which means really colonial Indology and others, is that the earliest writing in their time frame, earliest writing they found in India was an Ashokan script. And so they didn't have evidence of writing before Ashoka. And so this Indus script is sitting out there as a big unknown, and they don't even know if it is a script or a logogram or what it is. But in terms of a script itself, it looks like Ashokan script is the earliest. But now we know that Brahmi was used in other parts of India also. Tamil Nadu, we have found now 600 BCE, we have found scripts over there, the Proto-Brahmi scripts, which also have resemblance to the Harappan scripts. We also have from S.R. Rao's work in Dwarka, where he's found in Bet Dwarka what he called the transitive Brahmi script, which he has dated to 1500 BCE. So, here a siren in the background. I'll wait a minute for it to go.
Yes.
Okay. So clearly we have got a whole lot of evidence on where scripts came and so on and so forth. We also have a lot of references to writing in our traditional literature. If you go to Shatapatha Brahmana, where Yajnavalkya is saying that writing was done on cotton cloth and on copper. And if you want to ask the date of Yajnavalkya, if you ask the colonial Indologists, they'll probably place it to around 200 BCE or 300 BCE. However, from the internal evidence of astronomy over there about Kritika never swerving from the east, or in other words, the vernal equinox happening in the Kritika nakshatra, that can be dated to 2982 BCE, a very, very ancient period of time. So it is clear that Yajnavalkya is talking about writing on perishable media of that nature. And the very famous story of Vyasa and Ganapati, right? Ganapati is writing down the Vedas. And this shows that literature was already there, writing was already taking place on perishable media like palm leaves and other such things at a very, very early period of time. So in the Indian context, what we know is that we had the Shruti and the Smriti. So the stories that were told from an ancient time, if you sat in a circle in an ancient period of time and listened to an elder telling the story, you are connected by sound to the earliest Rishi who made that sound. Do you understand what I'm saying? In the context of a connection, because some Rishi at, let's say, 10,000 BC tells the story about Arundhati and Vashishta. From there on, it goes on generation by generation, circles. I've heard the same stories being passed down, and so on. So that we have heard, that which we have heard. As well as we have Smriti, where we have extensive records of writing and so on and so forth, other things. So clearly, both mediums have been used, and we can postulate that the earliest one was Shruti, that which was heard, and these stories are probably there from a very early period of time. We know from our understanding of the Puranas, at least, Vedavyasa is the author of these Puranas. We know that because that's what it says in the Puranas. So questions come, what is the time frame of Vyasa? Did Vyasa write the Puranas, or did he merely write down what already existed at that time frame? So many questions come about was it orally transmitted, was it written down, and so on. But what we can say is that in the Indian context, there was a lot of error correction mechanism, because just like if you play whisper in a circle and the word gets corrupted, so to prevent that, there were mechanisms in the Indian context where a word would be repeated forward, reverse, 2 syllables, 3 syllables, and so on and so forth. And this way you could check the error. So we know, for example, like Vedic transmission, the Vedas were transmitted without error in the same meter, in the same way it was chanted many centuries ago. For other genres of text, not very sure about that. But that's why maybe we have so many different forms available today. And same thing goes for why are different Puranas, Itihasas, different editions, I call it edition, but recensions, why are they different in various places? One reason could be this. It is the when it's being transferred, it's being copied, maybe errors are crept in, maybe additions have been made by various families, and so on and so forth. It's a fascinating story. It's a lot of things to talk about there, just in this transmission of knowledge itself.
Thank you. Yes, other questions, please.
This is Ravi. Just wanted to thank you for such a great talk. Just wanted to ask 2 questions. One is within the context of kind of a contemporary science when it comes to astronomy, astrology, so on and so forth, and Indian context. Is there any effort to kind of revive or kind of reestablish a link between what we call modern science and, let's say, our ancient Indian science? Is there any effort? Is there anything that is being done or we can do? That's one question. The second question is...
Let me take
Ravi,
one question at a time.
Leave it to one question, please. Yes.
One question at a time, because my attention span is low. I can't remember 2 questions. So it turns out that, Ravi, the question that you asked is right in the forefront of the contemporary battles that we are facing with the 5 malicious forces I talk about in my talks. There are 5 forces controlling identity and the narration of Indian history today, starting from the colonials, Eurocentric people, the vested interests, which means the church, for example, and the mosque, and going on to the liberal academic bias that talks about sociological models to talk about social dynamics in India, going on to the Marxists who have a different vested interest to destroy our identity. So these 5 forces have traditionally controlled the narrative of Indian history, and this is the received wisdom in academia. So anybody in academia is conditioned only to look at it in these 5 frameworks that I talked about. You're talking about a 6th framework, which is the internal, the emic framework. The emic framework, unfortunately, has been ridiculed. It has been discredited. It has been made into a bad word. Who did these things? The colonialists. The colonialists and the church, because when they started their activities, they believed that God created the world 4004 BCE. God destroyed the world, Noah's flood 3000 BCE. Nothing can survive that flood event. However, there are Puranic stories here that are talking about 3102 BCE, the so-called Kali Yuga clustering of the planets, which they could verify, and several other archaeoastronomical artifacts they discovered that are pretty ancient. And so to address that issue, how is it that the Hindus have astronomy that is older than their biblical records, which they believed in fervently as a truth? How could it be? So in order to address that, they took it on themselves to rearrange the Indian calendar, chronology, in the Purana king list, and so on. Some were mythical kings, threw them out, mythical dynasties. Some were real, moved some people here, moved some people there, shortened the chronology. shortened the chronology to fit a framework which they wanted with a few data points that could be collaborated. So in doing so, Max Muller, he proposed the so-called periodization, the Chandas period, the Mantra period, Sutra period, Brahmana period, all these kind of things. He stuffed all of the works, whether it's the Vedic works or the Puranas or the Brahmanas, Samhitas, Aranyakas, Upanishads, everything was stuffed from 1200 BCE till 200 BCE. This is what Max Muller did, because he believed in the Aryan invasion. And Sanskrit came to India, and these works were composed in India. Unfortunately, a lot of other colonialist Indologists were studying the Indian astronomy, other things, and one of them challenged Max Muller in one of the conferences in Europe and asked, should all of the Hindu chronology be held hostage to the biblical chronology? And this man, Max Muller, got so upset that he wrote an entire book on this called Astronomy of the Hindus, in which he said, I can only accept Colebrook's date for Vedanga Jyotisha at 1400 BCE, because that is after Aryan invasion theory, and the rest he could not accept. This is when, towards the end of his career, he was saying, what does it matter whether the Vedas are 1200 BC or 3000 BC, the knowledge of the Vedas is there. This is not an admission of knowledge. This is not an admission of maturity. This is an admission when cornered into a corner and you're trying to now rescue your works. That is when he said timing does not matter. These are the things that matter. He further went ahead and said in that book that all of the Puranas should be disregarded as sources of history. He said that they are unreliable texts. I cannot take them as history. And he set in stone a received wisdom for later Indologists that is carried on to the present day. In the present day, a toxic mix of secularism, colonial Indology, as well as difference anxiety, as well as this deracination has happened, so that any researcher who comes and talks about Puranas is immediately labeled as retrogressive, anachronistic, and somebody who's Hindutva, saffron. Every possible label is pulled out to discredit this person because they're mentally conditioned. They have a Pavlovian response. The minute you talk about the ancient Indian history, a Pavlovian response to patriarchy, to whatever you want to call it. These are the labels used to deride this. So your question was, has anything been done? Zero. Zero as far as the academia is concerned, zero as far as the government has been concerned, to my knowledge. If things are happening behind the scenes, I don't know about it. Now, what can we do? I think forums like this, we continue to educate each other about this. My talks, I talk extensively about these things. If you agree with the views, please share it in your circles and put comments on YouTube so others can also understand these things. So please do that. Do your bit. As we increase the awareness of each other, then our consciousness goes up and maybe we'll be able to change the narrative. If not in this generation, at least the next generation.
Thank you, Dr. Vedam. And this partially answers Prabhas Reddyji's question, but we'll come to that. But before that, I want to ask Dr. Topadkar's question, which is, what is the connection between astronomy of what the Hindu cosmic entity Mitra meant and what the Mitras, worship of Persians and Romans, and what led to the change of Mitra from astronomic depiction, which is identified with the sun later, to the bull-slaying, bull-sacrificing beef deity? That is the question. So if you can shed light on that, I can connect with you, both of you later. I don't understand
the latter part of the question. However, the facts do remain that the Vedic deities, Mitra also was one of them. And Mitra is known in various of these cultures, whether it's the Mitannis and the Hittites and so on and so forth. Many of the Vedic deities also encode the astronomical ages. We don't understand that because we think of everything in the narrow time frame of our 60, 70-year-old lifespans. Because in our lifespans, this is all we can conceive and imagine, that we don't imagine these huge time frames. We also have got this mental barriers on us of this Aryan invasion, that we believe that nothing can be more ancient than 1500 BC. This is a colonial thinking. They have put the barriers, they have put the constraints in our mind. So our minds cannot admit anything beyond that. However, if you remove those stultifying chains, then suddenly everything is open for us to explore and understand more in our own texts. So why did I say all that? Because there is evidence that we are uncovering of an ancient Indian civilization going back not just a few thousand years, but many thousands of years in regard to the astronomy that they have observed. So from time to time, the age changes, astronomical age also changes. There are many ideas I'm bringing over here to answer this question. So one of the ideas I want to tell you is that the earliest indication of Indian astronomy written down is in Atharva Veda and the Taittiriya Samhita. In these, the nakshatra names come fully developed. If something comes fully developed all of a sudden in a text, the question comes, how long was it there in a gestation period before it got to this final form? That is a question we need to ask. So these are not the dates that these nakshatras are invented, which is around 3000 BCE, but they are probably much more ancient than that. So that is one of the ideas. So each time, because of precision, remember there is something called precision that the Earth is doing. What is precision? The Earth, in addition to rotating once in 24 hours, in addition to going around the sun once in 365.24 days, the Earth is also precessing on the axis. The axis of rotation in Houston, I'm facing north, and approximately at 29 degrees in the sky, my hand is pointing at something, hope the camera can catch that. The axis of rotation is like that. So the Earth is spinning from west to east. That is my west direction, east direction. Earth is spinning west to east about that axis. And this means the heavenly bodies go from east to west once in 24 hours. That's what we see in the sky. However, where it is pointing to is also tracing a path in the sky. There's a very slow path it is tracing. And this circle that is making the sky takes 26,000 years to complete. And in doing so, where I'm pointing to now is Polaris. This is where Polaris approximately is in the sky. I should know because I'm also an astronomer. And approximately there, where I'm pointing to my other hand, that is where Vega is. Vega is a star we call Abhijit. So in this 26,000 year cycle, in about 13,000 years, the Earth goes from Polaris all the way to Abhijit. Look at the angle my hand is extending. That is approximately how much the movement the Earth's axis is spinning. So basically, Earth is spinning. If you look at my hand and body moving, it's going up to there in that circle. This is the extent on the diameter. Now it's actually doing that in a circle. So as it is doing that, the cardinal points of astronomy change. What are the cardinal points? The cardinal points means at the winter solstice, summer solstice, and the two equinox points, what were the nakshatras or the stars in those positions? Those are the cardinal points. So because of precision and the tilt of the Earth's axis, where the equinox happens or the solstice happens keeps changing. Do you see that? It keeps changing in the sky. That phenomenon is referred to as precession of equinox. Our ancients had noticed that. There was a period of time, for example, when Kritikas were the first constellation for us. Why was it the first constellation? I believe the story about Kritikas being made to live their husbands and go and become stars, because they're innocent, they're also made the first, most auspicious, first in the sky, the list of nakshatras. And this date we can put to 2982 BCE, like I said, we know that. We also know that there were ages prior to that. Before Kritikas were the first, something else was the first. And that time also had come and gone. For example, the Mriga Nakshatra. This famous story about Mriga and about the killing of the Mriga by Shiva and so on and so forth, the Rohini story and so on, that is also referring to a passage in time. So the same thing also goes with the story of Durga. Durga overcoming the lion, not the lion, the beast, the bull beast. It's Ashura. She's overcoming that. Even that can be recorded as an astronomical phenomenon at a certain age and a certain time. So many of what you're reading today, perhaps in academically generated texts, which take superficial meanings and try to make very strange connections based upon ideology, these things had to be decoded. You'll have to take them, unravel them, understand the ethic lenses that have been put on these frameworks, because of which they feel forced to adopt frameworks of patriarchy, feminism, and Brahminical tyranny, and all of these kind of things. if you accept these frameworks, then certain mappings happen to Indian history too. If you decode these frameworks and understand they have no relevance to the Indian context, we understand these stories are encoding different things. Most of the time, they're encoding the passage of time. The time when the first nakshatra in the list had to change because of precision. It gives you an indication how ancient the Indian observations are. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so a quick follow-up. We don't have much time, but a quick follow-up, and then I will close out with Prabhasji's questions. So is the precision movement termed Ayan movement in Sanskrit?
Yes, Ayana Chala. Yes, it is Ayana, called Ayana in Indian context.
Okay, great. So now the last question, and we'll close out with this. Prabhas Reddy from Bengaluru is asking, I'm paraphrasing this, so pardon me, what can we do to produce full-time scholars like you or people you can train to promote and correct the narrative of Bharat? It's a wide-ended question, but we'll close out with that and get your thoughts on this.
Very good question, but to correct it, I'm not a full-time scholar. I have a day job as an engineer, and this is what I do as a passion and trying to correct the history. So I guess there are two kinds. One is you're driven by a passion to change the narrative. You're a seeker of truth, knowledge, you're seeking it. At some point, you have accumulated sufficient critical mass, if you will, where you know that the connections can be made because of the sadhana you're done, your inner understanding and wisdom, and you're able to come and say some of these connections, what you believe. You could be wrong. There may be mistakes. Obviously, all of us do make mistakes. However, it gives us a chance to understand the landscape out there. So you ask, how do we get these scholars? One is there a forum where scholars can be generated? Not a forum, a full-fledged governmental program, because it's not something that cannot be done without a government policy. And I often say in a talk yesterday, I said, if Modi could come and do a surgical strike on currency and remove 1,000 rupee notes and other things overnight, and if you could do Balakot strikes in overnight, do things like that, surely education sector also deserves such a surgical strike. It can be done. One signature saying, we need to define the identity of this nation. Who are we? Are we a new nation from 1947 where we will not talk about our past because that is not secular? I'm not going to talk anything about my ancestors, about rishis, about the thousands of works they've done, about the 10,000-year history the civilization has had, because the minute I do that, I need to talk about Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism, and oh my God, I'm secular, I can't do that. So am I going to ignore all of that and say I'm a new nation from 47, only talking about cricket, Bollywood, and the maintenance of Mughal artifacts? Is that all there is to my history? Which is the framework that has been adopted today. So how do you change that? The Indian government has got to come and say, what is our identity as Indians? Who are we? Are we just our national anthem and the Tiranga, the flag? Is that all there is to us? Or are we the inheritors of this glorious civilization of the past? That thinking needs to get in. Once more of our political people understand that this is an ancient civilization and we are the inheritors of that, if you identify with that, then maybe change can happen. Like I said, a surgical strike overnight, correct our text, remove the etic lens entirely, the sociological lens that positions everything in class dynamics and imported frameworks from Europe, remove that entirely and try to see how can we look at things through a dharmic lens, and how can we look at everything in that context and tell our own story. It can be done. There are scholars all over the country. There are thousands and thousands of Sanskrit scholars, thousands of other scholars, but everybody's scattered. Not everybody has a voice. Not everybody's got the money, power, or other things to make their voice felt. So I don't have a good answer for you. I think the change has got to come from the government. Government has got to do it. Their thinking has got to be clarified. Once they do that, the population, the people who understand these things, they have to continue ramping up their efforts and doing what they're doing, going out like I do, give talks, give workshops, try to write books, articles, and try to be influencers, knowledge influencers, and try to spread the awareness in our people. As awareness grows, hopefully parents will feel empowered, saying, I'm looking at my child because I'm a double income. In today's world, inflation, both husband and wife got to work. And as you're a double income, you don't have your grandparents living with you. Then maybe we'll go to sorry for that metaphor over there, but maybe we'll have a better understanding of what our civilizational goals are and what we can do. When parents feel empowered to ask these questions and do the right things, maybe change can happen. But it's not going to be overnight. Overnight, the government can bring about an act understanding who we are. But the works have to be done. The scholarly works have to be done. Textbooks have to be revised, and understandings have to be made. It's a long journey.
Thank you, Dr. Vedam. May I close out with Siddesh's question, which was my last question to you. Where can we find your work? And my question is, may I share your email address in this group here so people can stay in touch with you?
Yes, please. Yes. So on social media, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, and I also have my talks that are posted on YouTube by various groups that I talk to. So please do search for my name, Raj Vedam, on YouTube, and you'll find several of my talks. So if you do agree with the views that I've put out there, please, I request you to share them in your circles. Leave comments, share them in your circles so you can get the word out. And yes, you can reach out by email. It's not a problem, but I do apologize in advance. I get a lot of emails asking for one-on-one kind of help on things. And I'm so sorry that my bandwidth is not there to address every one of you. So if I don't reply to you, it is not that I'm being impolite. It is only that I sincerely don't have the bandwidth to reply to everybody.
And for that, we will invite you again so we can have this kind of interaction again. So with that, thank you everyone for taking the time to be here with us. We could all be doing something else, but here we are, right? So thank you. And of course, thank you, Dr. Vedam.